This story is inspired by the real case of Arthur Moussolf, 1944, France. Imagine mourning someone for 20 years, 20 birthdays missed, 20 Christmases with an empty chair at the table. Imagine standing over a gravestone, whispering to the wind, believing that your son, your brother, your husband, died a hero in a war on the other side of the world. Now imagine learning that he wasn't dead. He was alive, living under a different name, in another country, with another family. By choice. This is not a movie. This is the true story of Arthur Moussolf, a soldier who was declared dead in World War II, only to be discovered alive decades later, living a new life in France. Not as a prisoner, not as a man with amnesia, but as someone who, for reasons no one fully understands, chose to vanish. It all began with a letter, an official military correspondence informing the Moussolf family that Private Arthur Moussolf had been killed in action in Europe. No body recovered, just confirmation of his unit's devastating loss during combat operations. Back home in the United States, grief carved itself into the family's daily life. His mother reportedly left a candle burning in the window every night. She'd place flowers outside their small Michigan home weekly, always the same lilies. For Arthur, she would say softly, his childhood bedroom became a shrine. Dust never dared settle there. And the years passed. Photos faded, letters yellowed. But the pain? That stayed fresh, like a wound that never scabbed over. Then, out of nowhere, rumors started to ripple through a quiet village in France. A man with an American accent. A man who avoided questions. A man with no clear past, yet a seemingly endless supply of World War II stories. He went by a different name, had a French wife, children, a life. But there was something off. Locals said he always looked over his shoulder. He never attended local ceremonies, never spoke of before. Some said he cried in his sleep. Others claimed he had scars, both visible and invisible. It wasn't until a French journalist, digging into post-war veteran stories, stumbled upon this stranger that the pieces began to fall into place. A photograph, buried in military archives, sparked the match. The resemblance was undeniable. But it couldn't be. Could it? The man was dead. Declared fallen in honorable service. There was a gravestone. There was mourning. There was closure, or at least the illusion of it. What would drive a man to abandon not just his country, but his name, his identity, his entire family? Some say it was trauma. Others whisper of secrets. But one thing is certain. Arthur Moussolf disappeared in the fog of war and re-emerged as someone else entirely. And what happened when the truth came out? That is where the story takes its darkest turn. The journalist's name was Etienne Leclerc, a young reporter from Marseille known for chasing ghosts. Stories of soldiers who vanished, families torn apart, war wounds that never healed. In the spring of 1968, Etienne was following a vague lead. An American man, living quietly in a rural village near Avignon, whose past was a blank slate. No military records, no immigration files, no official history. Just whispers and old wine-soaked conversations at the local bar. Etienne arrived in the village with a notepad, a camera, and a question. Who was this man really? The locals called him Henri Dubois, polite, distant, with a firm handshake and sad eyes. He had a French wife named Marie-Claire and 2 children, teenagers by then. He owned a small repair shop and attended church twice a month, never more. To most, he was just a quiet expatriate. But to Etienne, something didn't add up. When Etienne finally met Henri, the moment was electric. There was something in the man's posture. Military, disciplined. Something in the way he scanned the room before speaking. His French was fluent, but with a faint trace of an American Midwestern accent, barely masked. Etienne asked harmless questions at first. Where he was from, how long he had lived in France, why there were no photos of his younger years in the house. Henri smiled politely. "I was an orphan," he said. "My past isn't very interesting." But Etienne wasn't satisfied. Over the next few weeks, he began cross-referencing timelines, scouring U.S. military records, combing through old photographs and deployment lists from the war. That's when he found it. A black-and-white photo from 1944. A young American soldier, helmet tilted back, dirt on his face, eyes that seemed to hide a storm inside. Arthur Moussolf. The resemblance was chilling, but Etienne needed more. He reached out to surviving members of the Moussolf family in Michigan. Most had aged, scattered, remarried, but Arthur's younger sister Dorothy was still alive. And when Etienne sent her the photo of Henri, she dropped the phone. "That's my brother," she whispered. "I'd know those eyes anywhere." The discovery hit like a thunderclap. For Dorothy, it was a miracle. For Etienne, it was a career-defining moment. For the man known as Henri Dubois, it was the beginning of the end. Because when Etienne returned to the village for a follow-up, Henri was gone, vanished. His home was locked, his shop closed. Marie-Claire wouldn't speak. The children were confused. And all that was left behind was a single note, written in shaky handwriting. Some ghosts should stay buried. But why had Arthur Moussolf faked his death? What had he seen or done during the war that made returning home impossible? And what kind of pain drives a man to erase himself completely? Etienne wasn't ready to let it go, because the truth wasn't just personal. It was historical, and the deeper he dug, the more he realized. Arthur hadn't just run away from his past. He had been running from something far darker. To understand why Arthur Moussolf disappeared, we have to go back. Not to Michigan, not to the quiet village in France, but to the brutal forests of the Ardennes. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. It was the dead of winter, snow falling like ash. American soldiers dug into frozen ground, trying to hold back one of Nazi Germany's last desperate offensives. Arthur was 23, part of the 106th Infantry Division, a unit that had just arrived on the front lines and was immediately overwhelmed. Many of his fellow soldiers were slaughtered or captured within days. The woods were chaos, bullets, blood, and screams lost in the wind. It wasn't war. It was madness. And somewhere in that madness, something broke inside Arthur. According to classified reports, later uncovered by Etienne, Arthur had been separated from his unit during a retreat. He was presumed dead after a German artillery strike obliterated the position where he was last seen. No body was recovered. The army wrote his name among the fallen. But Arthur didn't die. He wandered for days, frostbitten, alone, surviving on scraps. At one point, he reportedly stumbled into a French farmhouse, collapsed at the door. The family took him in, nursed him back to health. For weeks, he hid in the cellar as German patrols scoured the countryside. And in that darkness, between survival and surrender, something inside him shifted. Maybe it was the trauma. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was what he saw, or what he did. Because Arthur didn't try to rejoin the army. He didn't signal for help. He didn't even tell the family who he really was. He just became someone else. When the war ended months later, Arthur, now calling himself Henri, simply walked away from the ruins of Europe and into a new identity. No one questioned him. In post-war France, papers were forged, names were changed, and scars were hidden. It wasn't uncommon, but most were running from crimes or punishment. Arthur? He seemed to be running from himself. Etienne's investigation uncovered a chilling lead, a missing persons report filed by a French woman in 1945, claiming that an American soldier who had stayed in her home disappeared one night, taking nothing with him, leaving only his dog tags behind. The address matched the farmhouse where Arthur had been sheltered, Had he left the dog tags behind on purpose? As a symbol? A severing of the past? Dorothy Musolf believed her brother had seen horrors he couldn't speak of, that whatever happened in those woods changed him forever. He was gentle before the war, she said in a taped interview. Loved painting, used to hum when he cooked breakfast. The army took that from him, gave me a ghost instead. Back in the village, Etienne tried again to reach Marie Claire, Arthur's wife, but she had vanished too. Locals said the family left in the middle of the night. No forwarding address, no goodbye. It was as if the truth, once uncovered, had scorched everything in its path. The man once known as Arthur Musolf was now a mystery again. A man who rose from the dead, only to disappear a second time. But Etienne wasn't done. He believed the answers were still buried, not just in war records, but in what came after. Because a few weeks after Henri Dubois vanished, a postcard arrived at Etienne's office. No return address, no message, just an old photo. A boy and a man sitting by a lake, the boy smiling. The man, not. Etienne stared at the postcard for hours. There was no handwriting, no stamps, no return address, just an old, faded image printed on thick, glossy paper. A boy no older than 10, grinning as he held a fishing rod, and beside him, a man sitting stiffly on a rock, staring at the water. The man's face was turned just enough for the light to catch the side of his jaw, and even in that blur, Etienne knew. It was him, Arthur Musolf, or Henri Dubois, or whatever name he was using now. But what did the postcard mean? Was it a warning? A farewell? A confession? Etienne had seen this before. Not the image, but the silence. Survivors of war, especially those who carried guilt or trauma too large to voice, often sent messages without words. Hints, symbols, ghosts folded into envelopes. And this image, this quiet lakeside scene, felt heavy with meaning. But what? He showed it to Dorothy Musolf. She gasped. That lake, she said, was real. Crystal Lake, just outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan. That's where we used to go every summer, she murmured. That rock, Arthur loved to sit there and sketch. Etienne's mind raced. Had Arthur returned? Was he back in the U.S., haunting old memories like a shadow? But no border record showed anyone resembling him entering the country. No airline tickets, no passport activity under the name Henri Dubois or Arthur Musolf. And yet the image was too perfect, too intimate, to be random. Then came another lead. One of Etienne's journalist contacts in Lyon, a war historian named Gérard Morel, reached out after reading a small column Etienne had published about the ghost soldier. Gérard said he'd heard whispers back in the 50s of an American vet living under a false name who used to paint watercolors in the countryside. He claimed one of those paintings, signed only with an A. A wow had surfaced in an estate sale years ago. A lakeside view, Crystal Lake. The trail went cold again after that. No more postcards, no sightings. The Musolf family, meanwhile, wrestled with a tidal wave of emotions. Relief, confusion, rage, closure, or something close to it. But not for Dorothy. She began writing letters, not to Arthur directly, but to his old self. Every Sunday. Letters filled with childhood memories, updates from home, apologies for whatever pain he had carried alone. She mailed them to nowhere, just placed them in a box by her fireplace. In case he ever wants to read them, she said. In case he still needs to know he's loved. And then, almost as if summoned by her grief, something happened. A letter arrived, postmarked from Morocco, written in English, signed with just one letter, A. I saw the flowers once, on the porch. They were lilies. I knew they were for me. I was too broken to come back. I thought disappearing would be mercy. Maybe I was wrong. That was all. No address, no promises. Just a broken man's whisper across the ocean. Etienne published a full-length exposé soon after, under the title "The Soldier Who Vanished Twice." It made waves across France and even reached American papers. Letters poured in from veterans who understood, from families with similar ghosts, from people who had never forgotten those who went to war and never truly came back. But for Arthur Moussolf, it wasn't fame he was after. It was silence. A silence he had fought for. A silence he had paid for. With his name, his family, and his place in the world. And somewhere, in that silence, he was still out there. Watching. Waiting. Haunted. What does it mean to erase yourself? Not just to disappear, but to deliberately unwrite your name from the world? To let the people who love you believe you're dead, while you walk among strangers as someone else entirely? This was the question that tormented Etienne long after the story went public. He kept the postcard. He kept the letter. He even kept a copy of Dorothy's lilies, pressed between the pages of his notebook, as a symbol of a wound that refused to close. He couldn't stop thinking about Arthur, or Henri, or the man whose name was never spoken aloud anymore. For Etienne, this wasn't just about one vanished soldier. It was about what war does to identity, to memory, to truth. He returned to the farmhouse where Arthur had first taken refuge after the Battle of the Bulge. It had long been abandoned. Vines swallowed the walls. The cellar door hung half open like a broken mouth. But in the damp stone chamber below, Etienne found something. A rusted metal box, half buried under earth and time. Inside, fragments. A sketchbook. Water-stained pages. Quick pencil drawings of faces. Most of them terrified. A battlefield. A pair of boots. A man holding his head in his hands. And on the final page, a portrait of a young boy, smiling up at the artist with innocent eyes. Scribbled below, "Je suis désolé." I am sorry. Etienne didn't know who the boy was. Perhaps one of Arthur's children. Perhaps someone else entirely. But the pain in those sketches was undeniable. This was not a man running from a crime. He was running from a burden. One drawing, folded into the cover, showed a soldier's silhouette dissolving into a forest. Almost like a spirit. Almost like a man choosing to vanish. The more Etienne uncovered, the clearer it became. Arthur Moussolf had never truly wanted to be found. But his story refused to stay buried. In America, the Moussolf family began receiving letters. From other veterans, other mothers, other siblings. Some accused Arthur of betrayal. Others called him brave. Some even claimed to have done the same. Lived under new names, hiding from pasts that didn't feel survivable. Dorothy read every single one. She said, "I don't know if my brother is alive. I don't know if he'll ever come back. But I know this. He was broken in a place no doctor could reach. And sometimes the only way broken things survive is by becoming someone else." A few months later, a package arrived at Etienne's apartment. No note, no explanation. Just a small wooden frame. Inside it, behind the glass, the original drawing of Crystal Lake. Signed in the bottom right corner, faintly, in pencil. A. Moussolf. It was the only time Arthur had ever used his real name since the war. Was it a goodbye? A confession? A step toward healing? Etienne never knew, but he hung the drawing on his office wall. And every time he passed it, he remembered. Some men come home from war with medals, others come home with silence, and some, like Arthur, never really come home at all. Years passed. The world moved on, as it always does. Wars ended. New ones began. The Moussolf case faded from the headlines, becoming one of those stories people vaguely remembered, like a dream that evaporates after waking. But for Etienne, it never ended. He kept receiving letters. Anonymous envelopes, fragments of leads, second-hand sightings. A man matching Arthur's description seen in northern Spain. Another in a coastal village in Portugal. Always alone. Always just out of reach. And the truth was, Etienne didn't want to chase anymore, because the deeper he went into Arthur's story, the more he began to see reflections of it in others. There was the British soldier who faked his death and became a fisherman in Cyprus. The German pilot who changed his name and built toys in Denmark. The nurse from Italy who vanished after the war, only to reappear decades later in Canada under a new identity, never explaining why. They weren't deserters. They weren't criminals. They were survivors of something so profoundly damaging that their only way forward was to stop being who they were. Arthur Moussolf had simply done it more completely than anyone Etienne had ever seen. And still, he left traces. Like a man walking through snow, always hoping the wind would cover his footsteps. Etienne began piecing together a timeline. After disappearing post-war, Arthur lived under at least 3 different aliases across Europe. Henri Dubois in France, Adrian Keller in Switzerland, and briefly, Anton Merle in Belgium. Each identity built on silence. Each life left behind just before someone got too close. The most striking evidence came from a former schoolteacher in Geneva, who remembered Monsieur Keller, a quiet man who painted watercolors and taught English part-time. She recalled a moment when she had mentioned America, and he flinched. "It was like I had pulled a knife from his chest," she said. But there was one common thread. In every town, every alias, Arthur left behind a sketch, always of the same place, Crystal Lake. It became a symbol to Etienne, not just of a place, but of a wound. Because in each drawing the lake was different, stormy, serene, empty, lit by moonlight, covered in snow. It changed like Arthur's soul, reflecting whatever state he was in when he drew it. Some were calm, some were tormented. One, never published, showed the lake frozen over. In the center, a small boy trapped under the ice, his hand reaching up. That image haunted Etienne more than any headline ever could. And then came the final piece. In 1977, a death was reported in a small town near Tangier, Morocco. A man with no family, no passport, no real name, but he had a collection of sketches. Dozens, all signed the same way. A.M. Local authorities cremated the body. No one claimed the ashes. Etienne traveled there, spoke to the locals, showed them old photographs, and finally, one old shopkeeper nodded. "That was him," he said. "The man who always watched the sea." And so after a life lived in fragments, Arthur Moussolf was gone for good. No funeral, no family, no folded flag. Just a man who had once fought in a war, died on paper, and lived in shadows. And in the end, his greatest act wasn't dying. It was disappearing. When Dorothy Moussolf received the news from Etienne that her brother had most likely died alone in Morocco, decades after the world thought he had perished in Europe, she didn't cry. Not immediately. She simply sat in silence, holding the photograph of Crystal Lake in her hands, her fingers brushing the signature at the bottom like it might vanish again if she let go. "I always wondered," she said finally, "what it would feel like to know the truth, and now that I do, I'm not sure I feel anything at all." Dorothy was in her 70s by then, the last surviving member of the original Moussolf family. Her parents had passed with Arthur's name still whispered on their lips. Aunts and uncles had died believing in the lie of his hero's death. Only she remained, the sister who had never stopped looking. She took Etienne to Crystal Lake one last time. It was fall. The trees bleeding red and gold, the water perfectly still, as if holding its breath. She walked to the rock, his rock, and placed a small tin box beneath it. Inside were the letters she had written to him over the years. Dozens. All unread. All unanswered. "I don't know if his soul is here," she said, "but this was the last place I remember seeing him happy." Etienne watched in silence. There was nothing to say. Because this wasn't a story about answers. It was a story about the weight of memory. The war no one talks about. The one that follows you home. That lives in your bones. That never lets you sleep. Arthur Moussolf didn't disappear because he was weak. He disappeared because staying would have destroyed him. And in his own way, he tried to leave behind something beautiful. Through the sketches, the letters, the silence. A man who had seen too much trying to make sense of it all with pencil and paper, with distance, with reinvention. He had been a soldier, then a ghost, then a father, then no one at all, but always a brother. Dorothy decided to have the gravestone updated, not removed, not changed entirely. Just one small addition beneath the name, beloved son, brave brother, and somewhere, still watching. In the years that followed, Etienne gave lectures about identity, trauma, and memory. He used Arthur's story as a case study, not to expose him, but to illuminate what war really does to the human spirit. He would show audiences the sketches. He would tell them about the postcard. And always, he would end with the same words. Some wounds are not meant to be healed. Some are meant to be carried, quietly, faithfully, until the end. He never tried to write a book. He never searched for more. Because the story had ended where it needed to, with a man's truth finally known. Not for the world's judgment, but for the quiet redemption of being remembered. Not as a deserter, not as a ghost, but as Arthur Moussolf, the man who vanished and was found again not in life, but in love. Years later, long after Dorothy passed away and Etienne retired his pen, a dusty archive box was discovered in the back of a library in Lyon. It was unmarked, forgotten. Inside were folders of clippings, sketches, handwritten notes, all meticulously preserved. It was Etienne's private collection. Everything he had gathered about Arthur Moussolf. There were interviews, photographs, and letters. A torn dog tag. A faded map of France marked with red X's. And in the very bottom of the box, rolled tightly and wrapped in twine, a large canvas. When unrolled, it revealed the final painting Arthur had ever completed. It wasn't of Crystal Lake this time. It was of a man, standing waist-deep in water, turned away from the viewer, the setting sun painting the ripples in gold. He wasn't walking toward the shore. He wasn't leaving. He was simply still, at peace. There was no signature, just one word scratched into the corner. Enough. It wasn't until that moment that those who had followed the story truly understood. Arthur hadn't just escaped the battlefield. He hadn't just run from duty or grief. He had run from the expectations of what a man should carry. In a world that worshipped resilience, he had chosen mercy. He had chosen to break. And in that breaking, he gave the rest of us something invaluable. The truth that not all scars are visible. That bravery isn't always about staying. Sometimes it's about knowing when you can't. His story became legend in quiet circles. A cautionary tale. A whispered confession. Veterans across the world read about him and felt seen. Families clutched their own unanswered questions a little tighter. And every now and then, someone would send a letter to Etienne's old address, addressed only to AM. No one expected a reply. But they wrote anyway. Because even a vanished man can leave ripples in the water long after he's gone. Arthur Moussolf never received medals. No ceremonies, no parades. Just 2 lives, one remembered, one erased, and a handful of sketches that spoke louder than words ever could. Today, if you visit the cemetery in Michigan where his gravestone stands, you'll often find something unusual there. Not just flowers, but drawings, little pencil sketches left behind by strangers, soldiers, artists, survivors. Some are crude, some are beautiful, but all of them whisper the same message. We remember you. Because in the end, Arthur Musolf didn't vanish. He simply stepped out of the light and let the rest of us decide whether to forget or to understand.